One of the other things that I think happened in the civil rights movement was that we temporarily forgot our fraternal associations. I knew Martin King was an alpha. He knew I was. But I think in all of the years of the movement, I don't think I ever gave him the fraternity handshake. And the reason was that we thought that we did not want fraternities, sororities, any class divisions, that the importance of social change was bringing all people together.
Sweat blood and tears, sweat blood and tears, sweat blood and tears, sweat blood and tears, na zoom, 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 zoom. And tears, na, sweat blood and tears, sweat blood and tears, sweat blood. Invictus by William Ernest Henley. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeoning of chance, my head is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishment the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul.
Dr. Jacqueline Rouse, I'd like to thank you for joining us and having us here with you today.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, ma'am. But can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I guess I'll give you the professional side. This is my 26th year at Georgia State. My area is African American women's history and African American history. I was involved in the last part of creating the Afro American Studies department here, and our classes are throughout the university. My area of interest is Southern Black women, particularly those who were strong activists in community building or, community activities, period. For the last 10 years, I've been basically looking at civil rights and Southern civil rights and gender and issues around indigenous communities, indigenous people becoming empowered to have their own agency and their own authority to make change.
Yes, ma'am. So can you also tell us about Plessy versus Ferguson and like what was going on in the community regarding race relations during that time?
Plessy versus Ferguson comes out of the what we call post-Reconstruction period, when things began to change. African Americans came out of slavery with a whole lot of hope about freedom and what was going to happen. But by the turn of the century, the white Southerners had gained control of the South, and they call themselves the Redeemers. And much of what the South looked like prior to the Civil War was an attempt to reestablish that. And within that was the era of segregation. Segregation started out before it became legal, and that's what the Plessy case is about. Before it became legal across the country, it was a custom that was practiced. So if I owned a railroad or if I owned a bus company and I decided I don't want everybody sitting together, then as a result I would organize the ridership so that you sit here, I sit here, somebody else sit there. One of the earlier women to challenge, we think of Rosa Parks, but one of the earlier women to challenge all this was Ida Wells Barnett, who we think of in terms of anti-lynching. But she was on the train, and she had brought a first-class ticket in the ladies' car, and they threw her out, and she sued, and she won on a lower level, but by the time it got to the Supreme Court of the state of Tennessee, she lost. So in developing out of that custom comes the legalization of it. So by the time you get to Plessy in 1896, it is businesses especially don't want, or the customers of those businesses don't want to have to share their space with particularly African American folk. Homer Plessy had agreed with some friends in Louisiana that he would be a test case because he was extremely fair. If you didn't know he was black, you wouldn't have imagined that he was. So as a result, he had bought a first-class ticket and had gotten away with riding in the gentleman's car. So he made a test case, became a test case. And he got thrown off the train. The conductor knew he was black. And he sued using the argument of the 14th Amendment, that his rights as a citizen were violated. And the case ultimately goes to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court rules that those rights weren't violated, because if there was not a space on the train for him, then he could say he had been discriminated against. But there was what we call the Jim Crow car, which is generally where people go with a luggage, and men go spit and smoke and and all those things. And here I am in my Sunday go to meeting clothes, and this is where I have to sit. So as a result, when it gets to when the case gets to the Supreme Court, it says that as long as there is a facility, but the problem was those facilities were not equal. So as a result, the end of the decision says the segregation is legal, but the facilities are supposed to be equal. Now we know that never happened because of the expense of making stuff equal. States were not going to do that. But this particular case that ushers in the 20th century also is around the same time period when you have what is called mob rule. Criminal justice for African Americans in the South was basically mob rule. There were very few fair cases, very few fair trials. If someone was arrested, the mob would just come and take them out of the jail and go lynch them, or whatever. So it is a very volatile time period in terms of race relations. The concept of white capping is where mobs of whites would go into a black community and run all of the black people out, usually allegedly around the threat that the white woman had been raped or molested or whatever. Such was the case in 1912 in Forsyth County. And blacks were ran out. You lose your property. There's no reciprocity for anything. You lost anything. Signs were put up that, no black folks after dark need to be in this particular town. And this is what happened from 1912 until 1987. And in 1987, Hosea Williams led a march for Dr. King's birthday and went to Forsyth and had about 25 people with him. And his reception was the people threw bottles and rocks and etc. And 2 weeks later, the last week in January of 87, people, about 20-some thousand folks from around the country came in response and in protest. and marched on Forsyth, and that's when you begin to, think of people moving to Forsyth who didn't ordinarily live there. So this is the kind of climate that Plessy versus Ferguson is given legitimacy to. And this is the kind of climate that social protest organizations or race-based organizations are created that talk about justice, that talk about, do we stay in America? Do we fight? How do we handle this? So Plessy legalizes segregation, which had started to be practiced, but it becomes legal now, not just in Georgia, it's legal in Minnesota, it's legal in New York, it's a national bill, or a national phenomenon. So as a result, the question then becomes, as Du Bois and others picked it up, how do I handle this double consciousness? How do I handle, the question is asked, do I stay in America? If I do I fight? Do I leave? Or what do I do? So that's sort of the contextual statement in terms of what the era that Plessy is coming into. One of my professors at Howard, Dr. Logan, wrote a book called The Nadir, about the Nadir. He calls it the portrayal of the Negro. And he says these years that ended the 19th century and opened the 20th century, he referred to as the lowest period in race relations. Between 1890 to about 1920, you had almost 4,000 folks lynched. So it's a very, very challenging time, to say the least, And very few people really took on the issue of racism. And where it was mainly among blacks, women, men, and some progressive whites.
Would you say that Plessy versus Ferguson led the Niagara movement? And if so, how?
Well, the Niagara movement is a part of several things. The Niagara movement are a group of men and women. Very few people know there were women involved too. But there were a group of men who were more so of the political suasion, I guess you could say, of Du Bois, in the sense of voting, demanding equity and equality based on the citizenship given by the Constitution. Part of their dilemma in terms of organizing is not just the injustice that Plessy versus Ferguson brought with Jim Crow laws, like poll taxes, literacy tests, and all this other type of stuff. But also it came about, also because of the power of Booker T. Washington. Washington had given a speech here in Atlanta in 1895 that essentially talked about accommodation with the South, black and white Southerners, and believing that economic development would be the answer to race relations. Chastising blacks who in the Reconstruction period went into political involvement first compared to industrialization. So as a result, with this speech and him being celebrated for the speech, he emerges as this major, not just educator, but this major political broker. And anything that was necessary for you to have, or anything that the black community thought or whatever, it was always ran by Booker T. Washington, by the white community. And if Booker T. didn't give the nod, then it wasn't approved. So people like Du Bois and William Monroe Trotter and some of the other integrationists wanted white America to know that Booker T. Washington didn't speak for them. And this becomes one of the reasons for the souls of black folks, as chapter 3 in it talks about Mr. Booker T. Washington and others. So these, the intelligentsia, I guess, or the academy begins to respond to Washington's message as well as his power. And they came together, and they couldn't meet on the U.S. side of the Niagara Falls, so they met on the Canadian side. So they come together as a think tank to really say, how can we handle not just racism and the oppression that we're dealing with, but how do we also handle the power of this one person who seems to give the impression that he is speaking for all African American folk. And from that, it becomes the Niagara movement is like the grandfather of the NAACP. So issues like the suffrage and issues like segregated public accommodations and the right to vote and the right to run for political office or to be involved politically. And then local issues like paved roads or health care or better education. All of those things become a part of their agenda, expecting as first-class tax-paying citizens for state governments, local governments to, comply with, which was not the case at this particular point. So the Niagara Movement is one of those organizations that it was created in 1905. The NAACP is 1909. The Urban League is 1911. The National Association of Colored Women is 1896. And then you had the fraternal groups, not the fraternal organization, not the fraternity and sorority, but fraternal groups like the Eastern Stars and the Masons and etc. So all of them are very much involved in the issue of racial accountability and how do we deal with Du Bois's double consciousness. How do we deal with being an American and deal with our nationality as an American, but at the same time recognize that we are of African descent and demand that culture to be recognized as well.
Right. And shortly after the Niagara movement, Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity was founded. Do you think that the Niagara movement and its founders had an influence on the founders of Alpha Phi Alpha?
Well, definitely. I think probably, as I was mentioning to somebody else, probably you're looking at the same group of people whose memberships duplicated in all of the social protest organizations, all the racial uplift organizations, all the organizations that's promoting racial pride and the uplift of the community, the promotion of young people, the promotion of families, etc. I'm willing to bet, if I was a betting person, that essentially you're looking at the same group of people. So I don't know the fraternal or fraternity association of the people who were a part of that small group of Niagara men who met originally. But I am willing to suggest that if they weren't alphas, that they were in some way, may have been a part of the Boule, I don't know, but they were probably some part of a organization that reinforced positiveness about manhood. And many of these organizations, the women do it for the women, the men do it for the men, in the sense of redefining African American womanhood and redefining black malehood. One of the things the black man does after Reconstruction and further is his desire to become the patriarchal leader of his home and of his community. And in terms of doing that, there are certain things that he wants to put in place, like the protection of his family, the promotion of his family, the promotion of education, the opportunities for himself, for his family, etc. Most of those are characteristics that you would find that people who are involved in social uplift would be committed to. So these are going to be underlying causes that the people in the Niagara movement will support. The people in the Niagara movement are the same people who founded the National Negro Academy, which was another sort of clandestine group who promoted higher education in the liberal arts, etc. Du Bois and all that crowd is a part of the National Academy. So I'm willing to suggest, and somebody else can look it up, that probably some of the Niagara folk, if they were not a part of Alpha, they were a part of the mindset that would produce fraternal groups that would be interested in the promotion of manhood, black malehood, and the positive images of African American malehood.
Gotcha. And what happened during the Women's Suffrage March of 1913?
Well, Delta was established, in 1913, in January of 1913. There was a national women's movement going back to the 1800s. In 1848, you may have heard the name Susan B. Anthony, created the first women's movement. As a matter of fact, Frederick Douglass was her vice president. And that movement crosses the 1800s and comes into the 1900s. When the 15th Amendment is added to the Constitution, it gave Reconstruction, it gave black men the right to vote, but not women. So you have this whole women's movement to get the suffrage. Part of getting the suffrage was that the Susan B. Anthony crowd had to then appeal to white Southern women and women around the country to get the amendment. Southern white women said, if you will guarantee us that you will not interfere in what we do to black women, then we'll support it. The same way the Jim Crow laws stripped the vote from black men, we want you to guarantee that you're not going to come here and protest and picket us when we don't allow black women to vote as well. So suffrage is going to be a part of the black women's movement, but they're not going to be able to participate in going, to actually doing the ballot. So as a result, as women are marching in order to get an amendment to the Constitution to give them the right to vote, there are already black women who have suffrage organizations. And keep in mind, they're fighting a double whammy. As I tell my students, sisterhood had never been strong enough to overcome racism. Because whenever it became necessary for the white woman to play the race card, she did it. And as a result, a prime example is the suffrage movement. So once the 15th Amendment empowered the black man and not the black woman and the white woman, and the black woman essentially went along with the black man, white women fell out with everybody. So when they were marching in 1913, it was a march down Constitution Avenue in Washington, again advocating for women to have the right to vote. The black women who had suffrage clubs petitioned to participate, and they said, no, you can't participate. If you want to, you can catch the end of the line, but we are not going to put you in the middle of this fray because it will mess up our constituency. Now, one of the black women who said, no, I'm not going for that, is Ida Wells Barnett. She had a group of women in Chicago who had a suffrage organization. So they came to the march, and when they told her, no, you can't march with Illinois, they said, fine. And then they just camouflaged themselves in the crowd that was watching the march. And when the state of Illinois came up and they saw the banner and the flags and all of that, they just slipped themselves into the Illinois faction and marched. But with the Deltas, they were told that they had to march at the back of the line.
Wow.
Yeah.
And its contribution to society is today?
Well, I think, with Alpha Phi Alpha, and we were the first of the kind of modern Black Greek organizations. There's kind of the direct work that they do, which is community service, empowering our own members and the communities that they actually have chapters, really representing a lot of Black empowerment and overall economic progress more broadly outside of the organization. And then there's all the indirect stuff, which is really providing, like I said, this community, this platform for engagement, networking, brotherhood, confidence, which you really can't, and you can never have enough with the challenges a lot of Black men face. And so the fraternity really is what I mean, like it is a 360 space for a member to really find support, find purpose, find job opportunities, find brotherhood. It's all there. And that's really where I think the fraternity has the greatest impact on the communities and the members who are part of it.